Okay, hi everyone. Um, I'm Dr. Aletha M, and thank you so much for coming out for my webinar series, Transformative Conversations Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Education and Beyond. Today we have quite a bit to talk about in relation to the Derek Michael Chauvin verdict that recently came out. And so the title of this particular um, discussion today is Black in America, the struggle for life, liberty, and justice. And I want to go ahead and introduce each of my guest speakers today. We have Dr. Rema, Counselor Grace, and Counselor Williams. And what I want to do is just read their bios for you really quickly, just in case you didn't have a chance to do that, because I want to be sure that you know who the wonderful guests are that we have today, and they're really amazing. Okay. So we have Counselor Robert Grace. Hi, how are you?
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening to some folks.
Yes. So you are Deputy District Attorney in Los Angeles County, and I'm just going to read a little bit of your bio for everyone. So Counselor Grace has been an outstanding prosecutor for the County of Los Angeles for 32 years. He joined the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office in the fall of 1988. During his tenure, Counselor Grace has been assigned to the hardcore gang, family violence, major crimes, and post-conviction and litigation divisions of the office. Counselor Grace is known for trying complex, high-profile cases, and I read a number of those cases too. So yes, very high profile. And yes, they are. And you have tried over 100 homicide cases and over 20 special circumstance murder cases, which is really impressive. Counselor Grace is currently the assistant head deputy of the hardcore gang division, where he is the supervisor for gang prosecutions at multiple courthouses. And he has received many awards for his work as a deputy district attorney. Counselor Brian K. Williams. He is the principal owner of the Brian K. Williams Law Group, a criminal defense and civil litigation law firm. He has handled matters in both state and federal court and has tried over 100 cases, which is also extremely impressive. Counselor Williams has served for 11 years, or he did serve for 11 years as an assistant city attorney in the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, where he handled criminal and civil matters. After several years in the criminal division, handling general criminal matters and assisting in the establishment of the domestic violence unit, Counselor Williams moved to the Special Operations Division, where he conducted specialized prosecution of high-profile cases, such as police officer-involved crimes, hate crimes, child molestation, industrial accidents, manslaughter, and environmental crimes. And we also have Dr. Rema, and she is an associate professor at Eastern Michigan University and also a trustee at Michigan State University. So for some of you who are always in my audience, you'll probably recognize Dr. Rema. She has been a teacher, a counselor, an administrator, a community organizer, and she's really just a strong academic leader. Dr. Rema's research is centered on urban schools serving culturally diverse students and families. Her work specifically examines issues of parent engagement as they relate to Black families and student achievement, instructional strategies educators can employ to honor and incorporate literacy students bring to the classroom. And she also focuses on cultural competencies counselors and school counselors acquire through their respective preparatory programs. Rema has a lot of books that are going to be forthcoming and that focus on underrepresented parents and students, and I'm excited to read those. Okay. my voice low? Is that what's happening?
That's what people in the chat are saying.
What's happening? Okay, I'm getting. All right, thank you. Okay, it's so interesting because this happens here and there with the webinars. As I'm talking, to me, I sound so loud to myself. I sound so loud, but I will definitely speak up, everyone, and definitely keep writing in the chat if you need me to speak a little bit more. Thank you so much. When I'm recording, so when you listen to the recording later, I'm going to sound fine. But yeah, I guess in this context, it's a little different. Okay, so I thought what we could do is just jump right in and talk about the Chauvin verdict. And I do have several questions for my guest speakers. So for everyone who is in the audience, if you have any questions for our guest speakers, can you please write them in the Q&A? That way I can see the questions, the guest speakers can, and we do want to address your questions. Okay, so I'll ask my questions and then I want you to pose your questions too for our speakers. Okay, so, just so everyone's on the same page, I'm sure most people, if not everyone who is here in the audience, is aware of the trial that just took place with Derek Michael Chauvin. And in case, I have any students possibly or people who are on here who don't fully know what's going on, I'm just going to give a quick summary before I move into my questions, okay? So Derek Chauvin is a former Minneapolis police officer who was on trial for second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter for the May 25th, 2020 death of George Floyd, who was a Black man. And I should mention that Derek Chauvin was white. Okay, so I was watching on YouTube, I was watching the PBS showing of the judge reading the verdict, excuse me, and the different counts. And so I want to go through each of the counts that are related to the guilty verdict. So verdict count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony. Verdict count 2, third-degree murder, perpetuating an imminently dangerous act. And verdict count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk. And the reason I wanted to read these different counts is because I've been getting a lot of questions from students, and even on my campus where I teach, a lot of people have been asking about these different counts. And so I was wondering if you could provide some clarity surrounding this guilty verdict and the language, related to these different counts. And so I guess,
yeah. Well, I'll jump in and I'll tell all your guests that the questions that you have are also many questions that lawyers around the country have, because the way that those verdicts came out is unusual. Definitely not the norm in California, where some of us are broadcasting from, and not the norm around the country and in many jurisdictions that I'm aware of. Brian can jump in here when he gets a chance. But so the first count is commonly known to a lot of people as what is known as a felony murder count. And so the best example that I can give you with respect to that is many people know, especially those that are in California, know if somebody is committing a robbery, let's say, and during the course of the robbery, somebody is killed, then you're not only going to be held liable if you're found guilty of the robbery, but you're also going to be found liable for murder, even though you may not be the person who actually committed murder in that instance. Maybe it was a co-defendant, or maybe somebody was killed during the course of the robbery by a third party. So that's the first count. The second count is would probably be commonly known as, in California, it's known as Watson murder, or murder during the course of, let's say, drunk driving, right? And in California, in order to be proven guilty of a Watson murder, the people or the prosecution has to prove that you knew that your actions were dangerous, and that you were on notice, you were made aware. In California, if you have prior DUI convictions and you killed someone while driving under the influence, then that's enough notice to you, your prior convictions, that you shouldn't, or you should, or you knew or should have known that driving under the influence was dangerous to people, and you're going to be held liable under what we call in California, it's second-degree murder. The third count is a negligent manslaughter count that people would commonly associate with someone being killed at the workplace, a work safety issue. You're operating heavy machinery, the machinery breaks and somebody's killed, one of the workers is killed, and the company bears both civil and criminal liability for the death of that worker. Generally in California, it would be manslaughter, and it would probably carry penalties for the owners of the company. So that's the best way that I can describe the three verdicts. Generally, in California, you couldn't get convicted of all three. The second verdict and the third verdict would get thrown out, and the person could only be held liable for the highest count, which is the murder count. I'm assuming here, and again, this is something that has been debated among a lot of attorneys around the country. I believe in Minnesota that their statutes allow them to charge what we in California would call lesser included offenses. I think people commonly know that manslaughter is a lesser offense, included offense to murder. So they must have a statute in the state of Minneapolis that allows people to charge lesser included offenses. And then we'll have to see what happens, whether the judge is going to be allowed to sentence Chauvin to time with respect to all three counts. And I'll be interested to hear what Brian has to say with respect to this.
Do you want me to comment on that, or you're going on to your next question?
No, go ahead, please. I know I looked like I was going to say something. I'm good.
No, Professor Grace, I think did a great job of describing those. And I think a lot of us who practice law thought it was very interesting that Chauvin was in fact convicted of all three of those, because so much of this is intent, what his intent was, what was going on in his mind. And so in a sense, we're saying that he intentionally killed Mr. Floyd, but then he also had such gross negligence that he killed Mr. Floyd. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works. It seems to be sort of a quirky thing for that particular state. But also, let me just say this. What I thought about the ultimate verdict, which I thought was so interesting, here we had a video, which showed 9 minutes of this defendant, Chauvin, with his knee on the neck, or the neck area, however you want to describe it, of this man, George Floyd. And all of us on this call, and I bet everyone here who's listening as well, had some doubts about whether or not the jury was going to find him guilty, until the judge said guilty count 1, guilty count 2, and guilty count 3. So what does that say about our system when you literally have a video of someone being killed, and there is still all of that doubt after 43 witnesses, special prosecutors, and millions of dollars spent? to prosecute this man. What is that really saying about our system? So I'll get off my high horse on that and defer again to Professor Grace.
Counselor Grace, do you have anything else to say? Since thank you both for what you're saying, because it's giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah, and generally, and Brian is right on point with respect to murder. Generally, you have to prove intent to kill in order to get a murder conviction, and then there are lesser degrees of murder based upon whether or not you're imposing intent through some other mechanism. And so, again, the best example that I can give you is the instances of felony murder, which I think people commonly know about that. If you kill somebody under the circumstances of another felony, most commonly it's robbery, and somebody dies, then you don't have to prove that that person intended to kill. You only have to be engaged in that other felony offense. With respect to manslaughter, there are many things or instances that can happen that can reduce a murder to a manslaughter. Usually it's what people commonly know as heat of passion. And that's like when somebody comes home, finds their significant other with another person, and they immediately kill that person, then that can reduce a murder to a manslaughter. I think here, as Brian points out, everyone was in suspense as to whether or not Chauvin was going to get convicted, when it was clear from the video that he intended to end that man's life. And even with that video, the prosecutors didn't charge first degree or straight second degree murder and try to prove intent to kill, because Chauvin was acting in the course of his duties. And that's probably the biggest issue with respect to charging police officers with any offense. If they're doing their duty, or if somebody gets killed in the course of doing their job, then it's very difficult to prove intent to kill in those instances.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to kind of come back to that when I bring up sentencing, because I do want to get into that and kind of hear your opinions on what that might look like. So Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison made a comment that went viral, and I want to read that, the comment, his statement, and then I'd like to hear your opinion. So he made the statement on the day of the guilty verdict. He said, "I would not call today's verdict justice, because justice implies true restoration, but it is accountability, which is the first step toward justice. George Floyd mattered because he was a human being." So how do you feel about this statement? Do you also feel this was more about accountability than some real win for Black Americans and for George Floyd and his family?
Okay.
And anyone can jump in.
Sure. I can speak to this question. I'm not a legal scholar like Professor Grace and Counselor Williams, but certainly in terms of justice and Black folks, I've studied this a lot and thought about it a lot. And when that verdict was read, it gave me no sense of relief. I did feel like, okay, I could put my riot gear away, like I had my boots and my mask ready, right? So I could put those away because we didn't have to take it to the streets. But I didn't think, and I did, so I did exhale, but that didn't seem like justice to me. If you think about what Malcolm X said, if you're pulling the knife out of someone's back, right? If you pull it out a little bit, okay. If you pull it out all the way, okay. You still haven't haven't really healed the wound of the knife. And so this idea that we have one verdict, and at the same time of the verdict, an hour before, you know, a young sister is killed in the streets, Micaiah, and then you know, right before that we had Dante Wright killed. I mean, it's a consistent onslaught of attack and assault and violence, mayhem and murder and terrorism among Black folks. And so this idea that somehow this one verdict is just, never. I mean, we have a long way to go before justice is complete. But I also think that, I'm a critical race theorist, I don't even think that this was about accountability for Derek Chauvin. I think that on a larger scale, interest convergence always has to be accommodated. And America was on trial. It wasn't Derek Chauvin, it was the United States. We had people in Australia, Belgium, Brazil, right, everywhere, Berlin, in the streets, talking about George Floyd and talking about Black folks in America. America has to remain blameless and innocent. And so in this, Derek had to take the fall so that the United States could look like it's pure and still well-intentioned toward Black folks, when consistently it has not been. You know, the UN will sanction you if you have war crimes against your own people. They'll sanction you for terrorism. The United States was in a precarious situation where we usually go in to help other people, but it looked like somebody needed to come in and help us. And so we had to make sure that somebody went down, and Chauvin had to go down. I mean, if we had to look like, no, we got this under control. We are a humane society, and we remain innocent in terms of whiteness. And so interest convergence meant that Derek had to go down. It wasn't about him. It was about maintaining this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's a question in there, and that Black folks are also able to do those things here in the United States, when consistently we're told over and over and shown repeatedly that our lives do not matter, and that at any given moment it's tenuous whether or not we can make it home to our families.
You know, can I add to that? You first of all, let me just say your screen background is off the chain. I appreciate that, Dr. Rema. But you know, what does it take for justice for us? In this particular case, we had a video that was shown around the world. We had officers who crossed that blue line. We had the chief of police who came out and testified. We had two special prosecutors from outside of the Attorney General's office who came in to try this case. And it took a global protest for this one case. So what does that mean for somebody who didn't have that video? What does it mean for me and for Bobby and for really all of us and many people who are on this call, where a municipality may not have those resources or the drive or the will to get this person? I think Dr. Rema really hit the nail on the head, that this is one where everyone who's in power had that collective reasoning to say, you know what, we better do something about this one because the consequences may be too great. But even in the midst of all this happening, you have Michaela Bryant, and then you have the Wright case, then the others that have occurred since then. So I think the Attorney General is absolutely right. This was an issue of accountability, but in terms of overall justice, it doesn't change anything unless there's some sustained, real substantive change to our system.
I can't add much to what Dr. Rema or Brian said on the topic, except to say that, that there are substantive changes that are reflected in the George Floyd criminal justice bill that's passed the House and is in the Senate. And there's significant changes there that would have real world effects for Black people and others who have been unjustly harmed by the police. And we definitely need to work day and night to try to get that bill passed. There's nothing more important with respect to criminal justice reform in America than the George Floyd criminal justice reform bill. And anything that your guests can do to help get that passed. There's nothing more important.
Thank you all so much, Counselor Williams, Dr. Rema, and Professor Grace. And yes, and so, you know, and I'm glad you brought this up, Dr. Rema, because I know we were talking about it too, about how, you know, I had the timeline, I wrote it down, you know, the Chauvin guilty verdict, right? That was read on April 20th, right? And then before that, on April 11th, we saw Daunte Wright be fatally shot. And that video is online if anyone hasn't seen it. It's horrific to continue to have to watch this. But I think it's also important for people to see what's going on. So he was fatally shot by a police officer after being pulled over in his car, and it looked like there was a scuffle that went down. And then the same day that the Chauvin verdict was being issued, Ma'Khia Bryant, right, who's 16 years old, and a teenager, she was killed. And then even after that, you know, even up until now, there have been numerous reports that have been coming out about the racial profiling, the continued racial profiling of Black people, harassment, mistreatment. So it just continues and continues and continues. And so that kind of brings me to my next question, thinking about what you all are saying. What will it take for there to be true racial justice for Black America? Because like you were saying, it took a worldwide protest and people burning buildings and just really kind of destroying cities for, you know, the system, right? Our legal system to do something, like you were saying, Counselor Williams. But what really is needed? What needs to be in place so that there can be real justice, right? Because there is, like, how are you all defining justice too, right? And what does that really look like for Black people in this country?
I would say, and I would change your question a little bit. You posed the question, what would it take for justice for Black America? I think justice for Black America means justice for all Americans.
Yeah.
Because this system affects everyone, but it seems to, you know, that it hits the brunt of us. I'll tell you a quick story. I don't want to take too much time. I sat in on an interview panel several years ago for a chief of police of a major city here in the Western US. And during this particular interview panel, this particular applicant, who's a very well-known applicant, turned to me and said, well, we asked the question, how do you change the image of your police department? And all you see are these big, tall, Nordic-looking guys with the boots and the glasses, and they're looking like stormtroopers coming into Black and brown communities. How do you change that image? And he turned to me and he said, well, if I see a guy that looks like you, and I'm about 6'3", 227 pounds, he says, well, I'm gonna have an extra added level of danger because you're a threat to me. And I really had to just stop and think about that question because he has no idea who I am, what I'm about. And there seems to be this initial extra added layer of perception of danger when many law enforcement people interact with the Black male or female. And we know this to be the case because we have too many sisters who've been felled by law enforcement already. So I think there has to be first a recognition that there is a different way that many in law enforcement will treat African Americans and people of color. There is just a difference, and there's that perception of extra danger, a perception that we have to do something a little differently with this person. And so there has to be first that recognition, I think, for the system to work. There has to be a recognition that it does impact our communities disparately and much more harshly. And when we talk about reform, I think that reform has to not only be with law enforcement, that reform has to be in the court system. That reform has to be with who we elect as district attorneys. The reform has to go the entire way. I also think it's important, and maybe we're going to talk about defunding the police and things of that sort later on, but I think it's important that we have people who look like us, who have our values in the department, and there has to be something done with this whole notion of qualified immunity at some point as well. So there's not just one big thing that can occur. I think many of them are ideological things. Many of them are issues involving race and perceptions of race. Many of them are going to be policies of the departments themselves, right? And many of them are going to be how we change our current system to hold police officers accountable. Listen, when you become a police officer, you aren't drafted to become a cop. There's no national draft for police officers. You are, in fact, volunteering to do this job. And when you volunteer to do that job, I have much respect for you because it's not an easy job, but you're also volunteering to really represent what this Constitution means in our nation, right? You're the person who can take a person's liberty away, in fact, can legally kill a person. There's a tremendous amount of power that goes with that. And with that power, there has to be some responsibility and some consequences for abusing that power. And that's the direction that we have to go.
Okay, I don't know if anyone wants to say anything or, okay.
I see that Professor Grace was unmuted. I didn't want to leapfrog him.
No, I'm back on. I was going to let you chime in.
Oh, okay, thank you. I appreciate the allowance. So I think we get to justice when the woman behind me is smoking this cigarette in the face of, you know, machine guns. I think that's when we have justice, right? Where the police are not a threat to us, but they are really doing their job, which is to provide safety and protection for us, right? So if we can get to the place where someone can smoke a cigarette in the police officer's face and be unbothered and not feel threatened, then perhaps we're at justice. I don't see that coming anytime in my lifetime, but to Brother Williams's point, I do believe that Black people are a threat. And that's what I thought, you know, maybe perhaps they'll let Chauvin off with that one caveat, right? That Black people are a threat no matter what, right? So you can come, it doesn't matter how I can come dressed up, I can come in flip-flops, it doesn't matter. My Black skin is actually a birthright of threat. And that when Derek Chauvin, after he killed George Floyd, he was talking to a Black witness, and the Black man said, you know, that was terrible what you did. And he said, well, you saw he was kind of unruly. You know, you saw we had to kind of struggle to get him, you know, under control. Like he was already building his defense, like, you know, he was a threat to us. And so I thought maybe perhaps because Blackness is seen as criminal, right, is seen as deviant, is seen as defiant, and seen as dangerous, Chauvin might get off. Because if you think about police and the history of police, the whole existence is to police our bodies. If you read Michelle Alexander's book, she kind of talks about this, but there's all kinds of authors who think about the role of paddy rollers and deputized folks who were then meant to get enslaved bodies back to their owners, right? And so this idea of policing Black folks, that's literally what the police are supposed to do. If they happen to get other folks, okay, but honestly, they're here to make sure that we're kept under heel. And that was a couple of politicians' words for us, that we need to be brought to heel. And so this idea that police are not supposed to see us as, or to, you know, to see us as humans, and that they're supposed to protect us, historically and contemporarily, that has not been their job. Their job is to keep us to heal. They're to make sure that we're under the thumb. And so I think justice would look like another heal, HEAL, right? Where we're able to see ourselves as fully human, and they can see us as fully human, and we're able to heal from the trauma of terror. Because what happens when you see things like George Floyd, and you talked about this, Professor Harven, a minute ago, when you keep seeing these images of Black death over and over, one, the bloodlust of America, where we want to see that kind of death over and over again, is fed, but then also we're kind of desensitized to it, right? Another person is killed, it's okay, next newsreel, right? After Derek Wright was murdered, I was in about 12 different Zooms about education, and it was brought up one time. in 2 days. It was brought up in one time. And so it becomes like, oh, okay, next, right? And so this desensitizing of Black death, then again, further dehumanizes us. So I kind of feel like justice would mean that when we see Black death, we recognize it as trauma and terror. If you think about hanging, and when we were being lynched and burned at the stake, and people came for the picnic, right? White folks gathered with their food, and they brought their families and their children, and they took souvenirs off the bodies of the people who were being killed. The people who were also there were the family members and the friends and the other folks who were enslaved, who were also having to watch, because that terror is for them. It's a message that this too can happen to you, and so you need to stay under control. But with that terror comes a trauma, and it never gets addressed. Black trauma doesn't get addressed, and it never gets healed. And so justice would mean that somehow there's a healing for Black folks that would allow us to smoke a cigarette in the face of police officers, instead of like the one time that I was, put into a backseat of a police car for no reason, praying, not thinking about Sandra Bland, and not praying that I make it home to my family, right? And then being let out, right? Like, oh no, it's just a warning, slow down, you can go home. And actually feeling gratitude toward the police officer for letting me go and letting me live. This is the kind of trauma and terror that this Black death over and over and over again, and the injustice of seeing these people who are murdering us being let off over and over again, it becomes an intergenerational trauma that then haunts us everywhere we go. We cannot get away from it. It's a consistent fear. So I think justice looks like Black healing, and within Black healing then becomes this Black humanization, which police officers have to recognize.
Hard to follow up on that one, Dr. Harven.
Yeah, it's tough to follow up on what you just said, Dr. Rema, and then also what you said, Counselor Williams. You just gave me a lot to think about, because I could actually feel your pain in what you were saying as well. Just the trauma of just watching what we continue to have to watch, these videos on television. It's very hard. I remember when I first saw George Floyd, that video, what was happening and how he was murdered. I remember I think I watched it on a Friday, or yeah, it was like on a Friday, and then the whole weekend, it's like I didn't want to do anything. Like I just couldn't. I just didn't feel I could even move, And there is trauma that comes along, you're right, with all of this, and we didn't address it. And the killing of Black people has been going on for a long time. It's being, as we've said before, it's just being filmed now. But even then, like Counselor Williams was saying, there's still lots of evidence that's being asked, right? Or that has to be given, even when you have it on video, what's happening. So something you said, Counselor Williams, because I know you and I had a conversation about this, the idea of defunding the police and reform. And so, yeah, I have been, and I'm sure, a lot of other people who are here in the audience, maybe they're out chanting defund the police, or we just keep hearing defund the police, defund the police. And my question is America really set up to defund the police? Is that really what people want for police, stations to be shut down? No more sheriffs. Like, is that really what people want? And so, I've been hearing different people too talk about, well, defund the police really means different things. But when I hear it, I hear, okay, we should just totally cut out the police. And I know that the relationship between Black Americans and police officers is a complicated one. I was wondering if you all could kind of speak to that and speak to this whole idea of defunding the police and the extent to which you think we're even set up as a country to do that. And is that really the direction that we should be going in? Or is that just like is that just the solution people are trying to kind of endorse right now, just with what they're seeing? And what they're seeing is bad, of course, but.
You want to start with me or Professor Grace?
Anyone can jump right in.
Go ahead, Professor Grace.
So I think Dr. Rema kind of set a backdrop for trying to answer this question in different parts. Police agencies are, by their very nature, paramilitary organizations. And as Dr. Rema eloquently pointed out, that oftentimes in American history, they've been used to brutalize, terrorize Black people, particularly in the South, during slavery and after slavery, during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, and then certainly into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It's not just, it wasn't just endemic to the South. We all know, particularly here in California, that there's the Rodney King experience. And for those of you who are too young to know, Rodney King was a motorist who was driving in the wrong part of the county of Los Angeles, was way to the north. After the Watts riots in 1965, many white people moved from South Central LA to the Valley and even beyond the Valley to the north of Los Angeles for quote unquote safety, making Los Angeles even a more segregated city than it already is. And many police agencies and police officers who worked for police agencies in Southern California, unfortunately, took on a warrior mentality. It's us against them. And so when Rodney King was beaten almost to death, and that was videotaped, many of the comments of the officers before and after kind of had this extremely racist statements similar to gorillas in the mist, comparing Black people to gorillas, and that these gorillas had to be controlled, right? And so America is fraught with that history of policing. And you're posing a question is how do we react as Americans, as Brian pointed out, because policing affects everybody in America. How do we as Americans react to this? And in particular, how do Black people react to this? Because unfortunately, we disproportionately are killed by the police under different circumstances. I would say no, the United States isn't ready to defund the police. Municipalities aren't set up, and American society isn't set up to not have a policing structure. And that has a lot to do with capitalism, the way capitalism works, and how America is situated within that particular socioeconomic system. Those that say, or that are in favor of defund the police would say, well, America wasn't ready for the modern civil rights movement. America wasn't ready for LGBTQ revolution. And many of the things that have happened in America just in our lifetimes, significant change. I think that there needs to be a reckoning within law enforcement that addresses the broader issues that Dr. Rema and Brian have brought up about this unjustified fear of Black people and other people of color, because it would be wrong for us not to acknowledge that other people have been killed by the police under similar circumstances. But that there has to be fundamental change within law enforcement. There has to be people who look like you and me who take on these jobs of being police officers. One of the big things that struck me about Ferguson was that, after Michael Brown was killed, it came out that they had an almost all white police force amongst a city that was almost all Black. And that can't happen. We have to have law enforcement that's invested in the communities in which they work in. We can't have this warrior or us against them mentality within policing, because if you do, then you will get the type of results that resulted in the killing of George Floyd, or the killing of Daunte Wright, or so many others. But we do have to come to grips with this. We do have to figure this out. Defunding the police is a nuanced word that has different meanings for different people. Obviously, we're not anywhere near there yet, but there has to be socioeconomic change in all of America so that Americans don't have to rely on police to deal with the problems that living in a capitalist society produces, right? There's always going to be homelessness in a capitalist society. There's always going to be gun violence in a capitalist society. There's always going to be inequality in a capitalist society. And so what do we do? How do we react to that? And how do we unlock resources to change the conditions on the ground in the communities that are most affected by policing? We have to have a Marshall Plan for Black Americans. We have to invest billions of dollars within the Black community to change the narrative in our communities and to really uplift our people and alleviate all of these major problems that have, because it's not just policing. As we found out from the pandemic, it's health disparities in healthcare. As we found out in the pandemic, it's disparity in terms of housing. I mean, everything negative in America, usually Black people are on the top of the list, are very close to it. So, we've got a lot of challenges that we have to deal with, and policing is just one aspect of what's ailing Black America.
And thank you for what you said. I was just listening and kind of taking it all in, and you're right. And I was also reading what was in the chat, what people are writing, and the whole idea of defund the police, what we continue to hear all the time in the news and by protesters. I do think that has different meanings to different people, and from very extreme to wanting to, as someone wrote here, and as actually Councillor Williams and I were talking about earlier, the idea of reimagining, right? Police departments and what those departments look like. And then someone did mention here, we need, Danya, we need culturally responsive law enforcement. So there's a lot of different ideas, I think, that a lot of people have about what can be done to improve the current system, and how a lot of officers, how a lot of officers are interacting with Black people. And, but yeah, the reason I wanted to bring up that question is because of what I constantly hear in the news, and actually just conversations I've been having with a lot of different people, and there have been a lot of different perspectives on it, and so I just wanted to see what you all thought about that.
That is one of those words that is a dog whistle, right? Those terms that are dog whistles that get people all riled up, but really defund the police is never about not having police. It would be, in the case of Ma'Khia Bryant, having people who are trained to de-escalate and to handle even mental health breaks, right? Instead of bringing the police to a place where a man is holed in his own home, having a mental break behind a couch with a knife in his own house, instead of bringing police there, you would bring mental health workers there, so he would have kept his life, right? If we even think about Ma'Khia Bryant, having been an educator for close to 30 decades in public schools, I've seen teachers disarm students with all kinds of weapons with no training, right? That the police had to use lethal force in order to get something from a child is really, to me, not believable. But also, then again, how can we make sure that we're having resources for social services, right? We disproportionately know that Black students are put into foster care. There's a reason for that, right? The pathologizing of Black families then leads us to be over policed in our own homes, and our children to be taken away from us, instead of preservation programs. And what Professor Grace was talking about, these kinds of ailments all compound, right? Intergenerational poverty, the consistent malpractice of education in our schools for Black students, all of these kind of converge in order to pathologize, demonize, and criminalize Black folks. And so defunding the police would mean that we're then redirecting those funds, $800 billion industry, to other services that could help prevent any of these tragedies from occurring. So it's decentralizing the funding for police to more support services and to eradicate some of the issues that would bring about the police. It's not to say that we don't need police, but the police that we do have do need to be reimagined, do need a different training. The woman who shot Daunte Wright was actually a trainer, and she was training someone while she brought someone, while she killed Daunte Wright. There was someone in training there. So what are we training them on, right? Like, are we training them on community policing strategies, on culturally responsive leadership strategies for policing? Are we training them on how to humanize Black folks? No, we're training on more of the same. So even education of police needs to change, but then the education of police, period. Right now, if I wanted to be a police officer, okay, I would need more hours to be a beautician, right? To prepare. Literally, cosmetologists have more requirements for education than police officers. And across the United States, we can see that police officers don't have beyond a high school diploma. The vast majority of them don't. And so this idea that training them, okay, but it's Stevie leading Ray. It's the blind leading the blind. If we don't have a disruption of what we're doing right now in a different way of thinking about police, we're going to get more of the same, because you get trained into the same racist systems. And so all the defunding is about changing the resources, the redirecting the funds to different resources, but also disrupting the way that policing is done now with a different kind of education, which will take money.
Leo, I just real quick comment on this, and I completely agree with what Bobby and Dr. Rema, what you all had to say. I think you're absolutely right. I want you to look at it this way as well. The state of Delaware has an annual state budget of about $4.5 billion. The budget for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is $3.3 billion. Policing is big business. And when we talk about reimagining and re-engineering and redoing what we're doing, there's going to be some pushback on that because of the business of policing, because of the business of jails, because of the business of supplying those jails and supplying the cameras and supplying the weapons. Those businesses are built upon our backs. So expect the pushback on that. We aren't going to move forward until we reimagine and reorder how we do policing in our community. Otherwise, people are just going to continue to die. One of the things I think that's great about policing in Los Angeles, something we're getting right, is this increasing push toward using mental health teams. Sheriffs have a med team. Pasadena Police has a HOPE team. LAPD has a special psychiatric team where they go out where there are folks who are suffering mental health crises, instead of having just the officers come out with the guns ablazing, if you would. But there just aren't enough. And again, it has to be that paradigm change, that difference in the philosophy of how we view policing. Ultimately, the question for me in terms of reimagining and looking at policing is, are they here to protect us or are they here to contain us? And that's where that difference is going to lie when they decide philosophically where they are.
I think that is so important, right? You follow the money, right? Where does the money reside? And we're seeing that it resides in policing and of the incarceration of Black citizens, right? If we and we I think as an educator, this all happens in schools. If we're thinking about the spending, for example, of corrections versus education, right? The United States spends approximately $36,000 per year on every incarcerated person. Michigan spends about the same. But if you think about what we spend per student, per pupil, it's $12,000, right? And for Michigan, it's $10,000. And so $80 billion are spent on corrections yearly. We're supplying those bodies, right? And if we are, just to your point, Councilor Williams, if we think we're going to reimagine policing that would then kind of get, there's a dearth then of bodies in those spaces where private prisons are contracting with public companies to get free labor next to free labor, right? I could spend 14 to 56 cents per dollar or per hour on someone who's incarcerated versus $10 or $12, right? So I'm going to put my call center in this private prison and have people who are imprisoned to make these calls for me. That makes sense, right? That we're going to get these bodies, these Black bodies, to be heavily policed and put into that pipeline. And that starts with schools, right? Danya Odom talked about reimagining schools because the policing of Black bodies is mostly this idea of training Black bodies to be policed in schools, where you are entering metal detectors, you have uniforms, you have bells, there's no talking, there's suspensions, there's detention, like we even have carceral language in our schools. It's to get us all set up to take our bodies into a space where they could be commodified, and actually we can use them fungibly for our own profit. Someone said reimagine capitalism, and I think Councilor Williams was talking about that too, because this really is about money, and it's really about why we were brought to this country, which was for labor, for free labor, and how consistently we're being brought back into free labor, right? Like, no, you can't escape this. We're Jim Crow laws, all these were to bring us back into free labor. And if we're not teaching children how to read, 86% of those who are detained cannot read, right? If we're not teaching people how to read, which these third grade reading laws in Michigan are about Black folks, right? Black folks have 3 times gone to the Supreme Court of Michigan to say, we want our children to learn how to read, and our schools aren't doing it. And 3 times the Supreme Court has said, you have to send your children to school by law, and by law, we don't have to teach them how to read, right? They have to show up, but if they read or not is on them. But if we think about in Texas, the superintendent of prisons and the superintendent of schools meeting every year to think about third grade reading scores and make projections for beds, this idea of policing and defunding the police would leave a lot of corporations hurt financially. Our bodies are literally for consumption, for production, right? And so the larger issue is this idea of capitalism and how we fit into that as free labor, and these laws in the 1960s and 70s that said that we could be free labor, almost free, right? If we're enslaved. Challenging all that is a challenge to our economic infrastructure. And so, yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Councilor Williams.
Yeah, this is all, there's so many pieces to the puzzle right here. And me being an educator, you know, I understand the school to prison pipeline, right? And the way our Black children are treated from the moment they walk into the schoolhouse. If Black parents are not heavily involved in what is happening to their children in the schoolhouse, then it's easy for their children to fall through the cracks, right? And what do those cracks look like? Well, it's just setting them up, right, for a lot of failure. And so I am glad that you did bring that up. And then, yes, like you said, capitalism was brought up too. And it's interesting how you talked about it, Dr. Rema, just about the free labor, the constant free labor, and what we're really here for, I guess, as Black people, and what we're constantly fighting, right? Okay, so what I would like to do, I feel like this, this got very deep. I feel like I have so much to think about, but I appreciate all of your comments. And I know that there have been questions that have been coming in to the Q&A box here. So I want to be sure that we get to some of these questions. Okay, so I think we kind of got to this question a little bit, right? What is your definition to defund? And so I know that Dr. Rema, well, everyone actually has addressed it in one way or the other. So I hope that, I don't know if anyone has anything else to say about this idea of defunding, but I think we talked about it for quite some time. Okay, another question. Should we contact our congressman to encourage the passage of the George Floyd bill?
Absolutely. There's nothing more important than that. That's got to get done. And we haven't really talked about a lot about qualified immunity. And so that's one of the big obstacles to that bill getting passed. But even if that falls away, the other parts of that bill are just really, really important. And that would outlaw chokeholds nationally. It would stop no-knock warrants nationally. Just so many other aspects of that bill that are important and could actually save lives going forward. So we have to do everything that we can to advocate for the passage of that bill.
Thank you. Well, I think this question was addressed by you, Dr. Rima. Let's see, do we use the Chauvin verdict to reimagine schools, more specifically the Black experience in schools? I was wondering if you had anything else to say about that. I mean, there's a lot of research for anyone who's interested. There's a lot of research on the school to prison pipeline. There's a huge amount of research on that if you want to read about that. There's lots of scholars, lots of educators who are addressing this issue, but I'm sure Dr. Rema has even more to say on it.
Yeah, I don't even know that we would call it a pipeline, right? I think schools are prisons, right? Like where our Black children are attending, you can't see much difference between what they're experiencing in schools and what they would experience in prison in terms of dehumanizing curriculum. Again, the carceral language that's even used, the restrictive dress codes, but then just the lack of joy, right? If you go into spaces, schooling spaces, and you see Black students, you'll see mostly joyless spaces. And if you think about how we kind of saw school, it's something to get through, right? Something that we had to go to get through. Sometimes it wasn't a place where we were always fired up to go. And I don't know that Black children are supposed to experience joy, right? Are supposed to experience healing, but especially in schools. You know, when I saw the little girl in Florida who was slammed on the concrete and was left unconscious right? Again, I thought about those Black students who watched that and the trauma of watching that, right? Thinking, okay, there's a kind of a helplessness, but then also the shame and guilt of inaction, right? They could all just rush that officer, but the fear is so palpable, like it's so compelling that they watched it, right? And there's this shame and guilt then that also then adds to the trauma. But then the girl who was dragged across the classroom by the SRO. And there was another Black girl who said, "Hey, listen, you can't do that." He said, "Well, you can get arrested too." So it's always this police presence in schools. Where I was a counselor last in Pasadena, we had a counseling suite. That's what it was called. It wasn't very sweet, but it was a counseling suite. And the police station was in the counseling suite, right across from our office. So what message are you sending to students when they have to go someplace and be policed? And in that space is supposed to be a place of learning, and here you are with detentions and suspensions and metal detectors and police officers with guns at your building. You're sending a clear message that these folks are criminals. They're not students first. They're actually suspects first. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, Mary Lou was talking about this, is push into these schools and say, listen, our children are children, they're innocent. They deserve to be treated with gentleness and care and love. And we demand police presence be gone. We demand all forms of policing be abolished. I've seen it happen in Detroit, right? Schools where there were strict policing in those schools. After George Floyd was murdered, they said, whatever looks like policing, we're not going to stand for it. And they changed their policies, but those were students, right? I think parents can do that with way more power and impunity than students can. And so I would encourage us, even if we're not parents, all of us on this call, right? We're not necessarily educators, but we're all responsible for public schools. And we're all, and you two specifically are seeing the effects of what happens when people are not educated properly, right? In your own work stations, you see what can happen when people are not given access to opportunity that education can give. So it's even if you don't have children or children that you like in schools, I think we're all responsible for what happens, particularly to Black children in those spaces. And so I think it's on us to push in and demand reform and transformation in our schools for our children, that they learn how to read, they learn how to read about themselves, and learn how to read about themselves as the brilliant Black, beautiful bodies that they are, not, just this one section in the paragraph on slavery, which was my experience as a kid, but that we're resilient and wonderful and awesome and the standard and the pinnacle, right? Like everyone wants to beat us, like that they learn that in their schooling, I think is really important. But then also that you take out all semblances of incarceration and any ideas of criminality. I think all of that, you need to do an audit of your local schools to make sure that Black children can go to school and be free.
Thank you, Dr. Rema. And I see Mary Lou, she wrote, what role did the parents play? And you kind of touched on that about how parents can push for reform. I'd like to tease that question out a little bit more and kind of see where else Mary Lou might have been going with it. Because I also think about, like I had mentioned before, sometimes the role that parents, like the additional work, right, that Black parents have to put in. And it's just so unfair, because while other parents, specifically while a lot of white middle-class parents can just send their children to school, and for the most part, their children are going to be treated fairly. Black parents, if they aren't aware what's really going on within the K-12 system, that's not the case. You just don't send your child and hope for the best. It's not going to be the same experience. So much research on it. I mean, I have, just like you, Dr. Rema, I have, worked with K-12 schools and educators for such a long time. And yeah, there's just this extra kind of burden that is placed on Black parents. And I would even argue other parents from vulnerable populations. If you are not involved, it is going to make a difference in how your child is treated at that school. You just cannot say have a good day and hope for the best. It's just not that simple, unfortunately. So I do feel that, for a lot of caregivers, if they don't really understand, the school system and how the school system truly does impact different groups of students and Black students, their own Black children in particular, then it is very easy for, unfortunately, their children to be policed within schools in ways that are really harmful, in ways that keep them from achieving at a level that they really should be achieving at, to help them. You really have to be there to help your children in a way that I think some parents, they have the luxury of not having to do all that, and so it's something that we do have to consider, what Black parents have to do, the role they really do have to take on if they want their children to be successful in school. And like you were saying, Dr. Rema, not have this policed experience. Or when they do have a policed experience, right, you're there dealing with it. And
I think we do. I
we do.
think Black parents, we show up for our children. But I think it has to be the people like us on this call who actually know,
Yeah.
right? I don't know that we could put it on Black parents who are really trying to make it, based on what Professor Grace talked about earlier, right? All these different factors of society that are working against us. Hey, we're just trying to make it, right? Like literally, we're trying to cope. The people who know and who have the social capital to make these changes, I think it's on us.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
And I wasn't, what I was saying, I wasn't trying to blame Black parents. I was just
no,
saying,
I didn't think you were.
oh yeah, okay. I was just saying there's so much more that Black parents typically have to do to make sure their children are achieving. But you're right. It's like, why do Black parents even have to do that? And Black parents are
And
doing it.
and we hope against hope that we're going to send our children to school and they're going to have a different outcome. And over and over and over and over again, we don't.
Yeah. Mhm. Right, because the statistics, they just stay the same, right? You keep hearing the same statistics, reading the same statistics over and over again. The achievement gap is like, this achievement gap has been around for way too long. Why is there still an achievement gap? And it's because of what's happening in schools. Like you said, it falls on, everyone who's within that school context and what they're doing to impact that child. Of course, there's going to be community related factors, neighborhood factors, home related factors, but for the most part, what happens within that school context plays a huge role in what happens to a child, Black children. Okay, and I think that there's a couple of questions or a few questions left. Okay, what do you, thank you, Dr. Rema. What do you believe is the most impactful, actionable objective that we can do to bring social change and justice to those who may have been left behind by slavery?
Well,
Can you
as I
repeat the
said,
question?
as I said before, and I'll rephrase it, Dr. Rema. They said, what is the most impactful change that could improve the quality of life for the descendants of slaves? So I kind of paraphrased it. I think that there has to be a Marshall Plan for Black people in America. There needs to be the same type of funding that went into Europe after World War II to rebuild the economies there. Obviously, scale to today's valuation of money, and that would mean billions of dollars going into communities of color, because it's not just Black people, but obviously we're talking about Black people here today. There has to be a transformation of the lives of people that would touch on health, touch on education, touch on access to jobs. And really that has to happen in order to to alleviate many of the things that you were talking about just now in terms of the achievement gap, you know, joblessness, homelessness, healthcare outcomes. All of this is tied to access to quality of living. And unfortunately in America, that's, you know, almost 100% predicated on your access to funding, access to education. And those are things that Black people and a number of other people in America increasingly don't have access to. When you're talking about the achievement gap, the wealth gap, I mean, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has grown even more than the achievement gap. And so more and more people of color, especially Black people, are getting caught up in that gap, the wealth gap. And if you're behind the 8 ball on the wealth gap, you can't catch up.
You know, if I can add to that, and I know the time is getting short, I want to answer a previous question and this question as well. You know, I have 2 sons who are, oh my God, I'm getting old. They are 20s. They're both in their 20s, both college graduates. But I think in terms of what the parents can do, number one was I always expected excellence from them, but also in how people treated them. I've dropped my sons off every morning at school and took them into the classroom because I wanted that teacher to see me and I wanted the fellow students to see me. And my wife would do the same thing when she picked them up. And if there was going to be some funny business, they knew that they had both of us to contend with. Some folks are going to come from a single parent home. I understand that, but you got a cousin George or an Uncle Lacey or whoever the case may be. You have to be present, and you want your kids to give excellence and expect them to be treated excellently. I made sure that they knew about the talk early on, that all of us Black parents have to give our kids and our nieces and our nephews about interactions with the police. The main thing was I wanted them to come home safely. And unfortunately, we have to just bite the bullet. And I hate to use that term, but too many of us don't make it home. But I always wanted them to know that we've got your back, that this is a battle that we will fight. But as a whole, in terms of our people and how we can make a change, I think number one in my book is vote, and making sure that we all have the right to vote. And all across the country, you see all around the country, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, all these attempts to restrict our vote. Why are they fighting so hard for this? Because when we got 50 senators in the US Senate, things began to change. When they got 45 out of the office, things began to change. And you see the power of voting, because that's tied to the power and of money. I would say that we simply can't give up. I read something the other day that said, a guy said, I didn't come for money, but I'm making sure that my kids and grandkids do. And that's the attitude that we have to have. You know, this fight that we're fighting may not be the fight that we're fighting for us in our generation, excluding you, Dr. Harven and Dr. Rema, you young folk, but it may not be a battle that you all are fighting, but it's a battle that we're fighting for the next generation. And it's a battle that we have to continue to fight over and over and over and over again. And then I think we cannot forget about those people who are our allies. Once again, what affects us is going to affect everybody. And we have to make sure that they recognize that. So voting is important. The expectations of excellence and making sure that our youngsters, their teachers are expecting excellence and not just enough for them to get by. No, we're not a get by people. Because if you take back and look, all that we've been through as a people in the history of this country, and look at who's on this call today. We can do this, and we are going to do this. We have to stay in the race.
There's just a couple of things I wanted to raise. One, I think I'll skip over the part about single parents. That I do think that, well, I won't skip over it. I think that Black women are raising strong Black children, and there is a myth that Black men are not engaged or involved in their children's schools. You want to mute Counselor Williams. I don't have muting power, but you do. Yeah. So I don't think he knew he was not muted. This idea that Black fathers are not present, that's a misnomer. It's a myth. And we know that Black fathers are the most engaged fathers. This is what the literature tells us, the research tells us, that they're the most engaged fathers out of every group. And so this idea that you have a single mom raising children, probably not. But also, even if they are, they're doing a bang up job, right? And so I just want to make sure we lift Black women, particularly thinking about what both of the counselors have talked about in terms of these gaps. There isn't really an achievement gap in terms of academic achievement. In fact, Black women are the most educated people in the United States. Black women are the most educated subgroup in the United States. But that wealth gap then still speaks to how women are underpaid and how Black women are underpaid. Although we are the highest educated in the United States, we're the lowest paid, and our wealth gap is the highest, the largest out of everyone. And so systemic racism, systemic heteropatriarchy and whiteness, and how that influences those of us who do succeed in this system, it needs to be challenged, right? You can jump through all the hoops and excel academically and still be the lowest on the totem pole, which would be Black women. So I think racial justice is still necessary, even if we get our act together, which I think we largely have our act together. But even if we are batting 1,000, I don't know sports that well. Is that good? I think batting 1,000 is supposed to be a good thing. I heard it. Okay, thank you. I've heard it a lot of times. So I think I'm using it correctly. But even if we're making all the baskets, we're on the all-star team, we're still being benched. We're still riding the pine. And so until we have racial justice, all of these things that we're talking about that we need to do will still fall short of realizing the American dream that Mr. Vassar talked about, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Black folks will still have that denied to us even when we do win. And so I think all of us have to really be mindful about voting, as you said, and how education then can be an equalizer, which it right now is not.
I was just writing notes, taking notes on what you were saying. Thank you so much. So everyone, I know it's been 90 minutes. It's, we're kind of going to close out. I just wanted to see if there were any other questions here in the Q&A that any of our guest speakers wanted to address. And I want to say thank you so much for everyone who's been writing in the chat. It's been a very active chat during the session. And then also we've been getting a lot of questions in the Q&A too. So if you want to stick around for any of the guests who can stay around and maybe answer one or two more questions, that would be great. Otherwise, if you have to go, I totally understand it. And I want to thank you so much for coming out today. But this is just such a great discussion. And I've just found myself this whole time kind of just sitting and thinking about what's been said, because so much has been said in such a short period of time. So there's a lot that I still need to kind of tease apart, I think, after this session. So thank you so much for all the audience members who have come out. And if you have to go, I totally get it. But I just wanted to see if there was one or two other questions that any of you wanted to answer that's here in the Q&A.
Professor Grace, there was one for you specifically.
Uh-oh, are you there?
You're muted, Bobby.
I was saying, what was that?
See, oh, I see it right here. It says, Professor Grace, could you define color of law and the historical narrative as it applies to police violence within communities of color? So Rodney King, and thinking about Rodney King, for instance.
So under the color of law means that whatever action the police took, they were doing in the course of their duties. So it wouldn't be something that happened when they were off duty or they were on a coffee break, et cetera, et cetera. It would have to be something that pertained to their actual duties. Usually that means some sort of policing action. And Dr. Rema gave a very good overview of kind of the history of policing in communities of color, particularly Black communities, that dates back to slavery and even before slavery, with citizen brigades. The history of policing started with volunteer groups that would quote unquote volunteer to police different areas. Usually it meant if there was a slave community in that area, that they were to help catch fugitive slaves or to put down any slave revolt, right? In the North, it was volunteer police agencies and volunteer fire brigades for the larger cities in the North. And as policing became professional, oftentimes there were very few people of color that were in any police agencies, be it city police, be it sheriff's departments. And oftentimes those agencies were used to terrorize or demonize Black folks, particularly in the South during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. And then in the so-called North, as Black people migrated to larger cities to take advantage of the mechanization of labor and get factory jobs, things of that nature. Oftentimes the police were used to, again, unfairly treat Black people in those communities. So the history of policing has been very fraught in America. And it's something that has been a constant issue that Black folks have had to deal with over time. I would be remiss to not point out that there are a number of great police officers around the country, particularly Black police officers who do a great job. We're fortunate to have a lot of Black police chiefs around the country, and that they do as much as they can to try to make sure that their departments are doing what they should do. But as we've been talking about for the 90 minutes, there are major issues that that all communities around the country are facing, and that using the word reimagining the police is something that has to be dealt with.
Okay, so I guess we can go ahead and end this discussion here. I know it's getting late. I just want to thank the audience again. I definitely want to thank our guest speakers. I really appreciated this conversation, as I mentioned before, and I think you've given everyone a lot to think about in terms of contextualizing how they feel about all that's been going on and that's continuing to happen in this country in regards to Black people. It does seem like, we're just born to fight. There's just this constant fight and battle that we have to engage in, and it is really exhausting, and it would be great to see, some form of racial justice. I am glad that the world kind of has their eyes open now, and they're really, taking stock of what's happening. It would be interesting to see if this continues, moving forward, if everyone's going to continue, making sure that various people are being held accountable for misconduct. So like you said, I think we have to just reimagine all of our different systems. our, I know Dr. Rema talked about the schooling system. I definitely think that needs to be reimagined. Law enforcement, and it does seem like there is a lot, like you were saying, Councilor Williams, even in Los Angeles, there's a lot that is being done right now to address all of these different issues. So I am glad to see that. It'd be interesting to see what happens across the country, in other cities too. So I am glad that in Los Angeles, there are changes that are being made. Okay, thank you so much again, everyone. And I'll be in contact with you all. And thanks again to all my guest speakers.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you for
I
having
just
me.
wanted to
Thank you.
just
Thank you for having
reiterate
us.
that we need joy, right? In the midst of all this trauma and terror, we need to find places of joy where we can
Right.
be revolutionary in our resistance, which is to be joyful. So get it however you can.
I think
And
we all need
Bobby,
to find
Grace,
joy.
with your new wife, get your joy
Oh,
on.
congratulations. Thank you. Thank you.
I know, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.